Jane Parsons here. Subscribe, won't you? This Christmas pudding hides more than spice.
The Christmas Pudding Mystery at Wisteria Teahouse. Chapter 1. A Spoonful of Celebration. Snow lay lightly upon the rooftops of Wisteria village, just enough to soften the cobblestones and lend the streets a storybook charm. Jane Parsons paused at the edge of the square, drawing in the festive scene before her. Paper lanterns hung from lampposts, glowing amber against the early winter dusk, while garlands of holly framed every shop window. At the heart of it all stood the Wisteria Teahouse, its windows aglow and fogged with warmth, laughter, and the promise of something sweet. A hand-painted sign outside announced, "Christmas pudding, tasting festival, all welcome." Jane smiled. She'd arrived in the village earlier that afternoon, intending nothing more ambitious than a quiet cup of tea and a few peaceful days away from London. Fate, however, had a habit of sweetening or souring such plans. Inside, the tea house buzzed with cheerful disorder. Long wooden tables had been pushed together to form a tasting line, each place marked by a proudly presented pudding, swathed in linen and decorated with sprigs of holly. Villagers moved about with flushed faces and eager chatter, clutching recipe cards and exchanging knowing glances. Jane removed her gloves and coat, noting the comforting scents that filled the room. Steamed sweet, citrus peel, nutmeg, and a whisper of brandy. Near the hearth, the hostess of the evening, Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, fluttered about, ensuring teacups were filled and tempers kept sweet. "Miss Parsons, isn't it?" Mrs. Marsh said, recognising Jane at once. "You've chosen the perfect evening to visit us. We're just about to begin." Jane thanked her and accepted a seat near the wall, perfectly placed for observation. Years of quiet habit had taught her that the best vantage point was always one where one appeared entirely unremarkable. At precisely 6 o'clock, Mr. Lionel Fairweather, the festival's esteemed head judge, took his place at the centre table. A stout man, with a neatly trimmed beard and a genial air, he cleared his throat and raised a silver spoon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, beaming, "the highlight of our Christmas season, once again. 5 puddings, each a labour of love, and I assure you, my sacrifice this evening is made gladly." Laughter rippled through the room. The tasting began in good order. Fairweather sampled each pudding carefully, pausing between spoonfuls to make notes and offer genial remarks. Jane watched him closely. He appeared in excellent spirits, chuckling at one baker's over-enthusiastic use of cloves, nodding approvingly at another's perfectly balanced sweetness. One by one, the puddings were judged. No sign of distress, no hesitation. As the final dish was tasted, the pudding soon declared the winner. The room erupted in applause. Fairweather rose slightly from his chair, lifting his spoon in salute. "A triumph," he declared, "a pudding worthy of Christmas itself." He lowered the spoon, and then, quite suddenly, faltered. The colour drained from his face, his hand flew to his chest, the spoon clattering against the table. A sharp intake of breath escaped him as he staggered back, knocking his chair to the floor. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos, someone screamed, another shouted for a doctor. Mrs. Marsh rushed forward, her face pale as she knelt beside the fallen judge. Jane rose quietly from her seat, already noting details others missed. The overturned spoon, the half-tasted dish, the 5 empty tasting plates arranged neatly in a row. "Poison!" someone whispered, the words spreading like frost across the room. Jane crouched near the edge of the gathering, careful not to interfere. Fairweather's breathing was laboured but present. His collapse had been sudden, yet not immediate. Her gaze flicked back to the table. 5 puddings, she thought. Not one. And yet whatever had caused this had waited, bided its time, chosen its moments carefully. As the village constable hurried in from the cold, snow dusting his cap, Jane felt the familiar stirring of unease and purpose. What had begun as a festive indulgence had, in a single terrible moment, turned into something far more serious. Outside, the lanterns continued to glow, oblivious. Inside the Wisteria Teahouse, a mystery had just been served. Chapter 2. Crumbs of Suspicion. The cheerful warmth of the Wisteria Teahouse had cooled perceptibly. Chairs stood abandoned where villagers had leapt to their feet, and the once inviting aroma of spices now felt cloying, heavy with unease. Constable Edgar Bell did his best to impose order. A mild, conscientious man, with a reddened nose and an air of earnest concern, he raised his hands and cleared his throat. "Now then, everyone, please remain where you are. Mr. Fairweather is breathing, and the doctor has been sent for. There's no cause for panic." His words did little to still the whispers. Jane remained near the wall, observing. Two women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, a cluster of bakers huddled together, voices low and urgent. On the central table, the 5 puddings sat like silent witnesses, their holly sprigs wilting. Mrs. Marsh hovered anxiously beside Fairweather until the doctor arrived and took charge, gently loosening the judge's collar and murmuring reassurances. Jane noticed how Fairweather's hands trembled. Not the spasms of poison, but something slower, deeper. Delayed, she thought again. Constable Bell turned, his gaze settling on the puddings. "No one is to touch these," he said firmly. "Not until we understand what's happened." At that, a sharp voice cut through the murmur. "Well, we all know which one did it." Heads turned toward Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne, a tall woman with iron grey hair pinned severely beneath a festive hat that did nothing to soften her expression. Her arms were folded tight across her chest. "I've said for years that some people will do anything to win," she continued, eyes flicking pointedly toward another table, "even if it means poisoning a judge." A ripple of unease followed her words. Constable Bell frowned. "Now, Mrs. Hawthorne, let's not leap to conclusions." Jane's attention shifted to the person Mrs. Hawthorne was watching, a young man standing rigidly near the kitchen door. Oliver Finch, the tea-house apprentice, looked as though he might vanish into his apron if given the chance. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't," he began, then faltered as several villagers turned to stare. Before the moment could harden into accusation, another voice spoke up, calmer, smoother. "This is all terribly dramatic, isn't it?" The speaker was Clara Whitcomb, the newcomer. She stood apart from the others, her coat still neatly fastened, her expression composed. Jane noted the faint tension in her jaw, the way her gloved fingers pressed together. "It seems far more likely," Clara continued, "that Mr. Fairweather simply overindulged. Christmas puddings are rather rich." Jane allowed herself a small inward smile. Too reasonable, she thought, at just the wrong moment. As Constable Bell moved between the small clusters, asking names and calming tempers, Jane edged closer to the tasting table. No one objected. She looked, after all, like any other concerned guest. The 5 tasting plates lay in order, each scraped clean save for the final one, which still bore a small indentation where the last spoonful had been taken. Jane leaned in slightly. There was a faint scent there, subtle, almost masked by spice, not arsenic, not laudanum, she thought, something older. Her eyes moved to the sideboard, where accompaniments had been laid out earlier in the evening. Jugs of cream, a dish of candied peel, and an empty space. Jane straightened, glancing about. "Mrs. Marsh," she said gently, catching the hostess's attention. "May I ask, wasn't there a jar of brandy butter here earlier?" Mrs. Marsh blinked, then frowned. "Why, yes, a large one. Mr. Fairweather was particularly fond of it, always added a little at the end." Jane's gaze returned to the final plate. Only the last tasting, she noted. Only after the winner was announced. Across the room, Oliver Finch was speaking quietly to the constable, his hands twisting in his apron. "I only argued with him about the scoring," he said desperately. "He promised to look at my work properly next year. He couldn't think I'd hurt him." Mrs. Hawthorne sniffed audibly. "Promises are easily broken." Jane turned away before the tension could deepen. Her thoughts were already arranging themselves neatly, like recipe cards laid out on a table. 5 puddings tasted, a missing jar of brandy butter, a collapse that waited for its moment. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the village in deceptive peace. Inside the tea house, suspicion had begun to settle, fine as flour, and just as likely to cling to everything it touched. Chapter 3. Recipes and Resentments. By the time calm was restored, if the brittle quiet that followed could be called calm, the Wisteria Teahouse felt smaller, its walls pressing in with unspoken accusations. Dr. Selwyn, the village physician, had insisted that Mr. Fairweather be moved to the private parlour to rest, assuring everyone that the judge was alive, though weak, and not yet fit to answer questions. Constable Bell took this as his cue to separate the principal parties. "Just until we understand things better," he explained, though his eyes betrayed the strain of suddenly finding himself at the centre of a most unwelcome affair. Jane accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Marsh and used the opportunity to drift naturally between conversations, listening more than speaking. People revealed far more when they believed they were merely filling silence. She began with Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne, who had stationed herself near the window, gazing out at the softly falling snow as though daring it to contradict her. "You've entered the festival many times," Jane remarked mildly. "Every year," Mrs. Hawthorne replied without turning, "and every year Mr. Fairweather finds something lacking. Too dense, too traditional, not fashionable enough." Her mouth tightened. "He never cared for old methods," Jane nodded. "Yet your recipe is an old one." "A true one," Mrs. Hawthorne said sharply. "Passed down in my family long before he set himself up as an authority. Some people prefer novelty, others understand heritage." There was more beneath the words than disappointment. Jane sensed it, but did not press. Yet. Near the kitchen doorway, Oliver Finch hovered uncertainly. Jane approached him with a kindly smile. "You looked quite shaken earlier," she said. "I didn't mean to argue with him," Oliver blurted. "I only asked why he'd marked my pudding so harshly last year. He said I lacked discipline." His voice dropped. "Then this year, he told me he might reconsider. I thought things were finally changing." Jane studied the young man. His distress felt genuine, unvarnished without calculation. "You hoped for his approval." Oliver nodded miserably. He was respected. "What good would it do me to harm him?" Jane agreed silently. Her final conversation was with Clara Whitcomb, who stood examining one of the tea house's framed photographs, a faded image of a much younger festival, bakers lined up proudly with their puddings. "A charming tradition," Clara said when Jane joined her. "So much history in one little room." "History has a way of lingering," Jane replied, "even in recipes." Clara smiled faintly. "Indeed, some flavours never quite disappear." Jane's eyes flicked to the photograph. One face, young, serious, standing beside an older man, had been scratched nearly beyond recognition. A deliberate act, not the work of time. "Do you know who that is?" Jane asked. Clara followed her gaze. For just a moment, her composure wavered. "No," she said carefully. "Before my time, I believe." Later, alone with Mrs. Marsh, Jane asked about the photograph. "Oh, that," the hostess said hesitantly. "Best not dwell on it. There was a disagreement years ago. A young baker accused Mr. Fairweather of stealing a recipe. It caused dreadful trouble. Family stopped speaking. Eventually, the fellow left the village." "And his name?" Jane asked. Mrs. Marsh hesitated. "Whitcomb," she said at last. "But that was a long time ago." Jane thanked her and returned to her seat, her mind turning. A rival baker with a grievance, an apprentice with wounded pride, a newcomer with a name tied to an old scandal. Yet none of it explained the careful timing, the waiting, the restraint. She recalled something else Mrs. Hawthorne had said, old methods, and the faint, unfamiliar scent that lingered on the final spoon. Jane rose and approached the sideboard once more, where a stack of handwritten recipe cards lay on display. She lifted one delicately, scanning the ingredients. There in the margin of a yellowed card was a note written in cramped, old-fashioned script. "Never substitute the preserved fruit. The old way is dangerous. Jane replaced the cards slowly. The motive, she realised, was not ambition, it was memory. Chapter 4. The Missing Butter. The snow had begun to fall more heavily, muffling the village beyond the tea house windows and turning Wisteria Square into a hush of white and gold. Inside, the mood had shifted from panic to a wary, unsettled watchfulness. Conversations now took place in murmurs. Glances were exchanged and quickly averted. Jane stood near the sideboard once more, her attention returning, inevitably, to the absence she had already noted, the brandy butter. Mrs. Marsh joined her, folding her hands anxiously. "I can't imagine where it's gone," she said. "It was set out just before the judging began. I remember distinctly. Mr. Fairweather even joked that it was the best part of the evening." "And he added it only at the end?" Jane asked. "Always," Mrs. Marsh replied. "He said it ruined the palate if taken too soon." Jane nodded. That detail settled neatly into place. With Constable Bell's reluctant permission, she stepped outside to take in a little air. The cold was bracing, sharpening her thoughts. A narrow path ran behind the tea house, toward the kitchens and refuse bins. Lantern lights spilled weakly over the snow, illuminating footprints, some deep and hurried, others meandering. Jane followed them. Behind the bins, half buried beneath fresh snowfall, lay a familiar shape. She brushed away the snow carefully and lifted the object free, the empty brandy butter jar. The lid was askew, smeared faintly along the rim, and the inside scraped nearly clean. Jane inhaled cautiously. Beneath the brandy's warmth lingered the same curious scent she had noticed earlier. Faint, resinous, unmistakably old. She returned inside as the doctor emerged from the parlour. "He'll recover," Dr. Selwyn announced, addressing the anxious villagers. But whatever caused the episode was not a typical poison. It acted slowly, building up before overwhelming his system. Jane met Constable Bell's eye. "May I ask, could such a reaction be caused by an ingredient rather than a toxin?" The doctor considered. "Yes, particularly something preserved using older methods. There were substances once common in kitchens that we now know to be unwise." A hush fell over the room. Jane stepped forward, holding up the jar. "This was found outside," she said gently. "Mr. Fairweather added brandy butter only to his final tasting, the winning pudding. Not before." Mrs. Hawthorne stiffened. "So you think the butter was tampered with?" "Not tampered with," Jane replied. "Prepared carefully, with knowledge." She turned to the assembled bakers. "Who here learned their methods from a recipe more than 30 years old?" Silence followed. Then Mrs. Hawthorne lifted her chin. "Many of us did, but some traditions were abandoned for good reason." Jane nodded. "Indeed, and someone remembered precisely which tradition to revive." Her gaze drifted at last to Clara Whitcomb. The newcomer stood very still, her face pale but composed. Around them, villagers shifted uncomfortably as understanding began to dawn. Not yet accusation, but recognition of something long buried stirring once more. Jane felt the final shape of the truth taking form. This had not been an act of impulse. It had been prepared long before the first pudding ever reached the table. Chapter 5. A pudding served cold. The lanterns had been lit outside, their soft glow drifting in through the tea-house windows. The Christmas lantern parade was gathering in the square, children laughing, bells chiming. Yet inside the Wisteria Teahouse, no one stirred. All eyes were fixed on Jane. "This isn't a case of modern poison," she said quietly, nor was it done in the heat of rivalry. She set the empty brandy butter jar upon the table beside the puddings. "It was done with knowledge, old knowledge." Mrs. Hawthorne let out a slow breath. "I warned him," she muttered. "I told Lionel years ago that some substitutions should never be made." Jane turned to her. "You knew then what could happen." "I knew," Mrs. Hawthorne replied stiffly, "but I did not act. I kept my anger, but not my hands." Jane inclined her head. "And that is the difference." She faced the others. Mr. Fairweather tasted 5 puddings without harm. Only after the winner was announced did he add the brandy butter, the final ingredient. That was when the reaction began. Constable Bell shifted uneasily. "You're saying the pudding itself wasn't dangerous?" "Not on its own," Jane said. "The danger lay in the butter, prepared with a preserved essence once used decades ago, before its effects were properly understood. It acts slowly. It waits." Her eyes rested on Clara Whitcomb. "You chose it because you knew he would add it only at the end," Jane continued. "You also knew about his weak heart. The collapse would not be immediate, but it would be terrifying." Clara's fingers tightened in her gloves. "You are not new to Wisteria," Jane said softly. "You are the daughter of Edmund Whitcomb, the young baker whose recipe was taken, whose name was dragged through scandal, and whose face was scratched from the tea-house wall." A murmur rippled through the room. "My father was ruined," Clara said at last, her voice steady but thin. "He trusted Lionel Fairweather, trusted him with his recipe. When he accused him of stealing it, no one listened. He left this village with nothing." Jane did not interrupt. "I didn't want him dead," Clara continued. "I wanted him to feel what my father felt, helpless, dismissed, unheard. The pudding competition was the only place he never refused to attend." Jane met her gaze. "Revenge does not always shout," she said gently. "Sometimes it waits like a dish prepared years in advance." Constable Bell stepped forward. "Miss Whitcomb, I'm afraid—" Clara nodded once. "I know." She glanced toward the window, where lanterns bobbed in the falling snow. "It seems fitting, on a night meant for remembering." The constable led her away quietly. As the tension eased, the sound of the parade drifted in more clearly. Carols, laughter, the soft crunch of boots on snow. Jane exhaled slowly. The truth, once uncovered, had settled like cooling steam, and outside Christmas waited. Chapter 6. Lanterns in the Snow. The square outside the Wisteria Teahouse glowed as though a small constellation had descended upon it. Paper lanterns bobbed gently in the hands of villagers, their warm light reflecting off fresh snow and softened faces. The earlier shock had not erased the ritual. If anything, it had made the gathering quieter, more thoughtful. Jane stood near the tea-house doorway, watching as Constable Bell spoke in low tones with Dr. Selwyn. Mr. Fairweather, wrapped in blankets and pale but conscious, was being prepared for transport to his home. "He'll live," the doctor said softly, "but he won't forget this night." Jane suspected that was true in more ways than one. Mrs. Hawthorne approached, her expression altered, less rigid, more weary. "I should have spoken years ago," she said. "I knew the truth about Edmund Whitcomb. Many of us did. Silence seemed easier." Jane met her gaze. "Silence often feels safe," she replied, "until it isn't." Nearby, Oliver Finch was being congratulated in hushed voices. Mrs. Marsh had taken him aside, speaking warmly. Jane caught fragments as she passed. Talent, opportunity, starting anew. The young man's shoulders had finally relaxed. As the lantern procession began to move, Mrs. Marsh pressed a small plate into Jane's hands. "You never did get to taste the puddings properly," she said with a tired smile. "This one is harmless, I promise." Jane laughed softly and accepted it. She stepped into the square as the bells rang, villagers falling into step beside one another. The lanterns swayed, casting dancing shadows on the snow. Somewhere ahead a child began to sing, and others joined in, voices weaving together like threads in a familiar cloth. Jane lingered at the edge of the procession, reflecting. Old betrayals she knew rarely stayed buried forever. Like forgotten ingredients in a recipe, they waited, patiently, for the moment they would be stirred back in. As the lights drifted away and the village returned to its gentle hush, Jane finished the last bite of pudding and smiled. Christmas, after all, was a season for reckoning as much as for forgiveness, and Wisteria Village had tasted both.